The morning I walked into the police station, I carried more than just evidence, I carried conviction. I had prepared meticulously, reviewing documents, checking timelines, and gathering witnesses. I believed in truth, in justice, and in the system that had always stood as the foundation of my career. I had never doubted that facts, clarity, and integrity would speak for themselves. I was wrong. Chief Raymond's office was austere, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare that made every surface look sterile, unyielding. I approached with calm confidence, my folder of evidence clutched firmly in my hands. I rehearsed my words silently, telling myself to stay composed, rational, and precise. But when I finally presented my case, the response was anything but rational. "Are you serious?" His tone was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Chief Raymond leaned back in his chair, his face an expression of disbelief bordering on ridicule. "You expect me to believe this?" I froze. The careful composure I had cultivated evaporated, replaced by a creeping heat of humiliation that spread from my chest to my face. I had rehearsed how to present facts, how to remain calm under scrutiny, but being dismissed so utterly, so publicly, was something entirely different. Being labeled a liar by someone in authority, not merely skeptical, but scornful, was an attack on my very identity. I have all the documentation, I began, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Witness statements, timelines, recordings. Everything is here. Chief Raymond waved me off dismissively. Documentation can be faked. Witnesses can be mistaken. You know this department well enough to understand that not everything is as it seems. I felt a chill run down my spine. His words weren't just disbelief, they were a verdict. In his eyes, my truth was worthless, my credibility null. I had risked exposure, invested time, and followed protocol, only to be told I was imagining reality. I tried again, carefully, painstakingly. "Chief, please, review the materials. I'm not asking for blind faith, just consideration. The evidence is thorough." He shook his head slowly, exasperation curling in the corners of his mouth. "I suggest you think carefully about your next steps. Lying to this department has consequences. Are you sure about your story?" Humiliation settled like a heavy cloak. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, to defend, to prove myself, yet his authority cast a shadow over my resolve. I had never felt so powerless in my life. The sting of being doubted, publicly and unequivocally, was suffocating. I glanced around the office, hoping for a flicker of empathy, some sign that someone would recognize the injustice. But the sterile walls, the blank faces of officers, and the hum of fluorescent lights offered nothing. Alone, I felt every ounce of my effort crumble. Yet in that moment of despair, a spark of determination ignited. I straightened, took a deep breath, and delivered my words with deliberate calm. "Chief, I am asking you to consider facts over assumptions. I am not here to fabricate or mislead. I am here to ensure justice, accountability, and safety." He leaned forward, fingers steepled, his expression unchanged. "I'll look at the files, but don't expect me to take you at your word. Not until I see something undeniable." I left the station that day with a mixture of humiliation and resolve. The sting of his accusation would follow me, replayed in my mind, with every detail of the encounter etched painfully into memory. But beneath it, a quiet determination began to grow. I realized that truth alone was not enough to guarantee recognition. I would have to fight for it, strategically and relentlessly. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I spread the files across the table. Each document, each photograph, each recording felt heavier with importance, and yet lighter with the empowerment of having prepared for this battle. The humiliation I had endured became a lens, sharpening my focus and strengthening my resolve. I understood that the world, and those in positions of authority, would not always validate my truth. Some would doubt, some would resist, and some would dismiss. It was up to me to persevere. I reviewed every interaction with Chief Raymond, noting his expressions, his gestures, and the underlying patterns of dismissal. I recognized that humiliation, though painful, could also be a catalyst. It exposed the challenge before me and clarified the path I needed to take. This was no longer just about proving facts, it was about reclaiming agency in a system designed to marginalize voices like mine. By the end of the night, the initial shock had transformed into a quiet determination. Humiliation had ignited courage, and fear had sharpened strategy. I knew that the path ahead would be arduous, fraught with resistance, and demanding of every ounce of resilience I possessed. But I was ready. The first act had been set. The chief had dismissed me, undermined me, and publicly called me a liar. But I had survived the humiliation. I had maintained composure when every instinct screamed otherwise. And in doing so, I had discovered that humiliation could be a weapon of transformation, igniting determination where doubt had sought to take root. As I prepared for the next steps, I whispered to myself, steady and unyielding, truth is relentless. And so am I. The morning after my humiliation at the police station, I sat in my apartment surrounded by stacks of documents, folders, and digital files. The sting of Chief Raymond's dismissal was still fresh, but the anger it sparked was transforming into clarity. Humiliation had a way of sharpening resolve, of turning shame into fuel. I realized that the truth I carried unseen, dismissed, and ridiculed needed more than courage. It needed strategy. Evidence alone would not convince someone unwilling to see. I had to build a case so undeniable, so meticulous, that even the most skeptical would be forced to acknowledge it. The story I carried wasn't simple. It had taken months to gather, layers of information intertwined with threads of secrecy, bureaucracy, and human error. Every document I had collected, every photograph, every recorded communication, was a testament to diligence. I reviewed them obsessively, checking for inconsistencies, double-checking dates, and ensuring that nothing could be challenged. This wasn't just about winning a personal battle, it was about exposing the truth that could affect lives far beyond my own. I thought back to the first time I had uncovered the discrepancy that would, later, place me in the chief's office. It had started innocuously, a minor anomaly in records I had been tasked to review as part of my role. But something about it didn't sit right. My instincts, honed over years of experience, told me there was more beneath the surface. What began as a small curiosity evolved into a systematic investigation. I traced communications, verified statements, and documented each finding. Each piece of evidence was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry of undeniable significance. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that the system itself was resistant to the truth. People with authority, including Chief Raymond, had reasons political, procedural, or personal to dismiss inconvenient facts. I encountered roadblocks at every turn, misplaced files, delayed responses, and bureaucratic stonewalling. Each obstacle was frustrating, each dismissal felt personal. I could feel the eyes of skeptics on me, judging my motives, questioning my credibility, and sometimes mocking my persistence. Yet I persisted. I organized my evidence meticulously. Financial records, official communications, photographs, and witness statements were all cataloged and cross-referenced. I created timelines, maps, and summaries, ensuring that anyone reviewing the information would have no room for doubt. Every detail mattered. Every shred of documentation had to withstand scrutiny because I knew it wasn't just my reputation on the line, it was the lives and integrity of others who relied on this truth being acknowledged. Working late into the night became routine. I would sit at my desk, the glow of my laptop illuminating the determined set of my jaw, poring over spreadsheets, emails, and audio files. Exhaustion was constant, but I drew strength from the knowledge that this effort was necessary. Every moment spent reviewing, confirming, and rechecking was a step closer to vindication. I had experienced doubt, ridicule, and humiliation, but these were temporary. The evidence was permanent, solid, and unassailable. Friends and colleagues began noticing my obsession. Some offered support, others skepticism, but I couldn't afford distraction. I explained little, revealing only what was necessary to gain limited assistance without compromising the integrity of the investigation. Trust had to be earned, carefully calibrated, because one wrong word, one misstep, could unravel everything I had painstakingly assembled. This wasn't paranoia, it was vigilance, and it was necessary. The more I examined the evidence, the more I realized the depth of the chief's dismissal. He hadn't just rejected me personally. He had dismissed the factual, tangible proof that could not be ignored. It was a calculated act, whether conscious or subconscious, and it underscored the stakes of my mission. If the truth was buried under bureaucracy, arrogance, or ego, then it was my responsibility to unearth it. No matter how difficult or dangerous the path became, One file stood out in particular, a series of emails between department officials that outlined mismanagement, negligence, and intentional obfuscation. The language was precise, the timing critical, and the implications profound. It was exactly the kind of evidence that could not be ignored, yet I feared the chief would continue to dismiss it as coincidence, misinterpretation, or fabrication. My preparation had to anticipate this, framing the facts in a way that demanded acknowledgement rather than opinion. Witnesses became an essential part of the case. I reached out to individuals who had firsthand knowledge of the incidents in question, carefully interviewing and recording their accounts. Every statement was verified, cross-checked, and documented. I knew that testimony alone could be dismissed, but when combined with the tangible evidence I had compiled, it formed a narrative impossible to refute. Each witness added weight, each corroboration strengthened the case, and every detail brought me closer to confronting the chief with an unassailable truth. I also prepared for potential challenges. I anticipated every question, every doubt, every attempt to discredit me. Mock hearings and rehearsals became routine, as I practiced explaining complex details in simple or irrefutable terms. I knew the chief would test my patience, my resolve, and my credibility. I had to be ready to respond without anger, without hesitation, and with absolute clarity. Confidence would be my shield, and preparation my armor. By the time I returned to confront the chief again, I was no longer merely a victim of dismissal or humiliation. I had transformed my frustration into strategy, my anger into evidence, and my doubt into conviction. I was armed with facts, with proof, and with a clarity that demanded recognition. The humiliation of the first encounter had become a catalyst, fueling the meticulous, exhaustive effort that now formed the foundation of my case. The evidence was ready. The truth was undeniable. And when I presented it, I would not ask for belief, I would demand acknowledgement. The chief could doubt, dismiss, or deny, but he could not ignore what I had painstakingly assembled. This was no longer a personal struggle. It was a battle for justice, integrity, and accountability. The journey from humiliation to preparation had been arduous, isolating, and emotionally exhausting. But it had also transformed me. I had discovered patience in frustration, clarity in chaos, and strength in perseverance. And as I stood ready to present the evidence once more, I realized that the path to vindication was not just about proving others wrong, it was about reclaiming my own power and refusing to be silenced. Returning to the police station felt different this time. I carried with me not just evidence, but a sense of purpose hardened by weeks of preparation, verification, and unrelenting focus. I had anticipated skepticism, prepared for disbelief, and rehearsed every explanation, every clarification. And yet, nothing could have fully prepared me for the intensity of the chief's resistance, the subtle, insidious web of denial that seemed designed to crush resolve rather than confront truth. From the moment I entered his office, I sensed the tension. Chief Raymond's eyes held a practiced coolness, but beneath it was the unmistakable glimmer of defiance. He had anticipated my return, anticipated my insistence, and was ready. The room itself seemed to conspire against me. Sterile walls, the hum of overhead lights, and the officers strategically positioned as silent witnesses. Every element reinforced the message: your truth is unwelcome here. I see you're back, he said flatly, leaning back in his chair as if my presence was a minor inconvenience. Do you truly believe more evidence will change my mind? I met his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. It's not about belief, Chief. It's about facts. The evidence I've compiled cannot be ignored, dismissed, or fabricated. It speaks for itself. He smirked faintly, the expression of someone accustomed to dismissing challenges. Facts can be interpreted in many ways. What you see as truth may be nothing more than coincidence or misreading. Are you certain you're not forcing meaning where there is none? The words hit harder than expected. It wasn't overt mockery, but the subtle dismissal, the undermining of logic, intelligence, and credibility. It gnawed at the edges of confidence. Humiliation was not just public. It was cerebral. Each sentence was calculated to make me doubt myself, to plant seeds of uncertainty. And yet, I refused to give him the satisfaction of faltering. I laid out the first set of documents carefully, spreading timelines, communications, and cross-references across the desk. These are not interpretations, I said, voice steady. Each detail is verified, each sequence confirmed. If there is a discrepancy, it is in your unwillingness to acknowledge it. not in the evidence itself. Chief Raymond leaned forward, scanning the pages, but his eyes betrayed little reaction. "You've done your homework," he admitted reluctantly, "but the department has procedures. You may have a case, but there's no urgency here that requires bending rules." I felt a surge of frustration. Every word he spoke was a brick in the wall of denial he had constructed around himself. This wasn't just resistance. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain control, to keep inconvenient truths buried under bureaucracy. The humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that he had no intention of changing stance. "No matter how clear the evidence, I am not asking for urgency," I replied, maintaining composure despite the pressure. "I am asking for accountability. Ignoring evidence does not make it disappear. Delaying justice does not protect the innocent, it endangers them." His fingers drummed on the desk, a subtle but unmistakable signal of impatience. "You must understand the complexities involved. Not everything is as black and white as you believe." I took a deep breath. Complexity does not excuse dismissal, nor does nuance justify ignoring incontrovertible proof. "Chief, the complexity does not negate responsibility. Procedures are only meaningful when they serve truth and justice. Ignoring the facts compromises both." He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and for a moment, the air in the room was heavy with tension. I realized then that the web of denial was more than a tactic. It was a shield for ego, authority, and the discomfort of confronting mistakes. Every officer present seemed aware of this unspoken dynamic, watching, silent, complicit, yet unable or unwilling to intervene. I pressed on, each word deliberate. "I am not here to challenge your authority. I am here to ensure that the truth is acknowledged and acted upon. The evidence is here. The witnesses are available. I am asking you to honor your duty, not personal preference." He sighed, the faintest sign of frustration flickering across his features. "You persist. I'll give you that. But persistence alone does not compel acknowledgement. People in power don't always accept inconvenient truths." Humiliation deepened not from anger, but from the realization that the chief's denial was structural. It wasn't merely disbelief. It was the calculated avoidance of accountability. And yet, even as my confidence wavered momentarily, I recognized the embers of a greater truth. The system, flawed though it was, could not withstand relentless, documented, undeniable evidence forever. Persistence, preparation, and patience were my weapons against his web. I introduced witness statements next, carefully correlating each account with timestamps, communications, and documented events. Every statement aligned with the evidence, every corroboration strengthened the case. I could feel the chief's resistance waver slightly, not fully, but enough to sense that his control over the narrative was slipping. "You're meticulous," he said quietly, almost begrudgingly. "I cannot deny the detail. But I still question the interpretation." Interpretation. Another subtle attempt to shift responsibility, to make doubt reside in my mind rather than in his. I maintained composure. "Chief, interpretation is grounded in evidence, not opinion. The narrative is clear when all facts are considered together. Disregarding any piece distorts the truth." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Humiliation had evolved into suspense, the kind that grips the chest and refuses to let go. I realized that the struggle was no longer personal. It was systemic. The chief's denial represented an entire structure resistant to accountability. But it was also a precursor to change. The first recognition, however reluctant, that truth could not remain hidden indefinitely. I left the station that day exhausted but undeterred. The chief had tried to crush me, to bend reality to his disbelief, and to render my evidence irrelevant. Yet, in doing so, he had also revealed his vulnerabilities. Denial is powerful, but it is fragile in the face of relentless, indisputable proof. And proof, I now knew, was the only language that could compel acknowledgement in a world where ego often outweighs justice. That night, I reviewed every document, every witness statement, every timeline. Humiliation had sharpened into clarity, doubt into determination. I understood that the battle was far from over, that suspense would continue to build, and that the chief's web of denial would require both strategy and courage to unravel. But I was ready. The foundation had been laid. The story was set. And the next act, the intervention of authority beyond the chief, was on the horizon. Weeks had passed since I had faced Chief Raymond's calculated disbelief. Every day had been a battle against frustration, against the creeping doubt that comes from being dismissed by someone in a position of authority. The humiliation of his denial still lingered like a shadow over my confidence, but persistence had become my armor. I had double-checked evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and ensured that every detail of my case was airtight. And yet, the system's inertia was daunting. I knew that to force acknowledgement, the truth needed intervention from a level beyond the chief's influence. It came unexpectedly. The call arrived on a late afternoon, just as I was compiling a new set of documents to revisit the station. My phone buzzed insistently, displaying a number I did not recognize. With a cautious sense of curiosity, I answered, "Is this Officer Taylor?" A calm, authoritative voice asked. "Yes," I replied. My pulse quickened. Something about the tone was different from the bureaucratic monotony I had grown used to. It carried weight, credibility, and command. "This is Lieutenant Commander Reynolds, Pentagon Intelligence Division. I've been reviewing a series of reports and discrepancies forwarded from your department. We need to discuss your findings immediately." For a moment, I was silent, the words sinking in. The Pentagon. They were calling me. The level of authority, the scope of power behind this call, it was beyond anything I had dared hope for. Suddenly, the frustration, isolation, and humiliation of weeks felt like distant echoes. Someone with real authority was now taking my evidence seriously. I gathered myself and responded, careful to keep my composure. "Yes, Lieutenant Commander. I've documented all discrepancies, communications, and witness accounts. I can provide a full briefing." "Excellent," he replied. "We need a secure transfer of materials immediately. Once we review them, we will determine next steps." Your attention to detail and persistence have not gone unnoticed. The call ended, leaving me simultaneously elated and nervous. The scale of what was unfolding began to hit me. My months of labor, my sleepless nights, and the emotional toll of being dismissed by Chief Raymond were about to intersect with a level of authority capable of forcing real accountability. Relief washed over me, but beneath it was a pulse of adrenaline, the realization that the next stage would test not just my evidence, but my resolve, patience, and clarity under scrutiny. Over the following days, the interaction with the Pentagon unfolded. Lieutenant Commander Reynolds coordinated secure channels for transmitting my compiled files. I delivered them piece by piece: documents, photographs, recorded communications, and witness statements, meticulously organized. Every file, every page, every timestamp was scrutinized before being sent, ensuring that no flaw could undermine credibility. It was during this process that I began to feel the full weight of the turning tide. My persistence, previously met with ridicule and dismissal, was now validated by the highest levels of authority I had imagined could intervene. The humiliation I had suffered at the hands of Chief Raymond began to lose its sting. It was not erased. It had shaped me, but it was now overshadowed by the anticipation of justice and recognition. Reynolds called multiple times, asking pointed questions, clarifying inconsistencies that were minor but critical to maintain credibility. Their attention to detail mirrored my own obsessive diligence, and it reinforced a sense of shared purpose. Unlike the dismissive tones I had faced at the station, there was focus, respect, and acknowledgement. This was not validation born from comfort or convenience. It was acknowledgement grounded in fact and integrity. Then came the most unexpected part: a directive for immediate review by a specialized Pentagon task force. My evidence, once ignored, was now in the hands of experts who had both the authority and resources to act. Each call from Reynolds confirmed progress, and each confirmation eroded the residual power of Chief Raymond's dismissal. What had once seemed insurmountable humiliation by someone in control was now confronted by a system designed to uphold truth beyond the reach of ego or bias. The revelation was profound. Persistence, accuracy, and courage could pierce even the most impenetrable wall of denial. I realized that humiliation had not been an endpoint, but a catalyst, a proving ground that had tested my resilience and prepared me for recognition at a higher level. The shadow of the chief's disbelief remained, but it was now dwarfed by the illumination of authority beyond his reach. As the Pentagon review proceeded, I was briefed regularly. Each session revealed more about the depth of the issue, the extent to which discrepancies had been mishandled, and the potential consequences if ignored. The stakes were higher than I had imagined, but the clarity that had emerged through months of preparation now guided me. I was no longer reacting from a place of personal indignation or humiliation. I was operating with purpose, precision, and strategic intent. One evening, After a particularly detailed briefing, Reynolds paused and said, almost conversationally, "Officer Taylor, your persistence has ensured that this will not be buried. The chief may have dismissed you, but the system cannot. Your documentation and thoroughness are beyond reproach. Prepare yourself, what comes next will require courage of a different kind." I absorbed the words quietly. Courage had always been a companion, but now it was tested, not against ignorance or dismissal, but against the weight of accountability and the inevitability of confrontation. The Pentagon's intervention was not merely validation, it was a turning point. The web of denial that Chief Raymond had woven was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. Humiliation, persistence, and revelation had formed a continuum. First, the sting of being called a liar. Second, the exhaustive compilation of evidence. And now, the intervention of a higher authority capable of enforcing accountability. Each stage had tested me, and each stage had strengthened me. I spent the night preparing for the next steps. Meetings, briefings, and secure transmissions would continue, but I felt a quiet confidence settling over me. The chief's authority, once absolute, in my experience, was now limited by systems far greater than him. The evidence I had painstakingly gathered, once ignored, would now drive action that could not be suppressed. In the solitude of my apartment, I reflected on the journey so far. Humiliation had not destroyed me, it had sharpened my focus. Persistence had transformed frustration into strategy, and revelation from an unexpected authority had turned despair into hope. The battle was far from over, but the trajectory had shifted. Truth, validated by power beyond ego, was on the move, and I was at the center, prepared to see justice enacted. The call from above had changed everything. It was not the end of struggle, but it was the beginning of vindication. And in that realization, I found strength, clarity, and a renewed sense of purpose. The call from the Pentagon had shifted the entire battlefield. What had once been a personal struggle, a humiliation at the hands of Chief Raymond, was now a matter of documented accountability, supported by authority that could not be ignored. Yet the path to exposing the truth was far from simple. The chief had power, influence, and a stubborn resistance to scrutiny. And while my evidence was airtight, the fight to compel recognition demanded strategy, patience, and unwavering courage. I started by coordinating with Lieutenant Commander Reynolds and the Pentagon team. Every document, witness statement, and recorded communication was reviewed in detail. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced to ensure it could withstand scrutiny at the highest levels. The task was exhaustive, meticulous, and mentally taxing, but it had to be flawless. Any error, no matter how minor, could be exploited to dismiss the entire case. As I prepared, I reflected on the months of struggle leading up to this moment. Chief Raymond's dismissal had been more than personal insult. It was a structural barrier. His subtle undermining, his questions framed as concern but laced with doubt, had been designed to make me question my own judgment. The humiliation of those encounters had been sharp and relentless, but it had also forged me. I now faced the next stage not with insecurity, but with precision and determination. The Pentagon coordinated a formal meeting with department officials, including Chief Raymond. I was to present the evidence, walk them through timelines, and ensure that the facts were undeniable. It was the first time the chief would be forced to confront the totality of the documentation, the witnesses, and the corroborated details. The stakes were immense, not just for me, but for the integrity of the system itself. Walking into the conference room, I felt the weight of months of preparation settle onto my shoulders. Chief Raymond was already there, seated with a composed but subtly defensive posture. Officers around the table shifted slightly as I entered. I had rehearsed this moment countless times, yet the sight of him, the man who had mocked and dismissed me, still sent a flicker of tension through my chest. I focused, breathing deliberately, grounding myself in the truth I carried. "Chief Raymond," I began, voice steady, controlled, "I am here to present evidence that has been meticulously compiled, verified, and corroborated. It is not a matter of opinion or interpretation, it is fact." He leaned back, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Officer Taylor, we'll see if this is truly as compelling as you believe," he said. The calmness in his voice, belying the tension I knew simmered beneath. I started with the timelines, laying them out clearly, showing the sequence of events with cross-reference communications, photographs, and official documents. Each point was precise, each fact verifiable. I guided the room through the evidence step by step, allowing no gaps, no ambiguity. Every detail had been prepared, every potential counter-argument anticipated. As the presentation progressed, I noticed subtle shifts. Officers who had once appeared neutral began nodding, eyes widening as connections between events became undeniable. Even Chief Raymond's posture changed slightly, leaning forward, fingers steepled, his confident mask beginning to falter. I could feel the shift in the room. The web of denial he had maintained was beginning to unravel under the weight of meticulously compiled truth. Then came the witness statements. I played recordings, read sworn accounts, and presented corroborating details for each testimony. The alignment between witnesses and evidence was undeniable. The room grew quiet, the weight of truth pressing heavily on every participant. Chief Raymond's defenses became increasingly subtle micro-expressions of disbelief, fleeting signs of frustration, but the foundation of his resistance was cracking. "Officer Taylor," he said finally, his voice restrained, "this is thorough, but there are still procedural nuances to consider. Are you confident all interpretations are accurate?" I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze directly. "Chief, this is not interpretation. This is fact. The evidence as presented is accurate, verified, and corroborated. Any delay or dismissal at this point compromises the integrity of the department and the trust of those it serves." The tension in the room was palpable. What had begun as a personal battle had become a systemic confrontation. The chief could no longer dismiss the evidence without exposing the department to scrutiny, accountability, and potential consequences. I had transformed my personal humiliation into a weapon of clarity, and it was now forcing recognition at the highest levels. Minutes turned into an hour as questions were asked, clarifications made, and every detail reviewed. I remained composed, patient, and precise. I could sense the chief's internal struggle, the reluctance to admit fault, the instinct to maintain control, and the undeniable truth that he had been proven wrong. This was the reckoning I had prepared for, the confrontation between denial and documented truth. Finally, Reynolds spoke, voice measured but authoritative. "Chief Raymond, the evidence has been presented comprehensively. It is not subject to personal belief or interpretation. Accountability is required. Dismissing it would have consequences." The chief exhaled slowly, the weight of exposure pressing down. The room held its collective breath as he leaned back, silent for a long moment. I felt a rush of quiet triumph, not gloating, not vindictive, but the deep, satisfying awareness that persistence, preparation, and courage had forced acknowledgement. When he finally spoke, the tone was subdued, tinged with reluctant concession. "Very well. The evidence is compelling. We will initiate the recommended procedures and investigations." Relief, vindication, and exhaustion washed over me. The fight to expose the truth had succeeded, not through confrontation alone, but through diligence, patience, and meticulous preparation. Humiliation had been transformed into power, doubt into determination, and persistence into accountability. As I left the conference room, I reflected on the journey. The chief's initial dismissal, the web of denial, the subtle psychological tactics, they had all been formidable obstacles. But through careful strategy, unwavering persistence, and the intervention of higher authority, the truth had been exposed, and accountability was underway. The fight to expose the truth was not easy. It demanded emotional resilience, intellectual rigor, and moral courage. But the reward was profound. The system, which had initially failed me, was now responding to integrity, evidence, and persistence. The humiliation I had suffered had been transformed into a catalyst for vindication, and the reckoning had begun. That night, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. The path ahead would still have challenges. The chief's legacy of denial might linger. Bureaucratic obstacles could persist, but the truth was no longer ignored. My fight had reshaped the narrative, and as I prepared for what came next, I felt a profound sense of purpose, clarity, and empowerment. The reckoning had begun, and I was ready to see it through to the end. The day of the confrontation arrived with a tension that settled over me like a heavy fog. I had spent weeks preparing, coordinating with the Pentagon, reviewing evidence, and rehearsing every possible scenario. Yet, nothing could fully prepare me for the moment when I would face Chief Raymond directly, not through documents, not through intermediaries, but eye to eye. Accountable to the undeniable truth I carried, I arrived at the conference room early, every step deliberate, every breath measured. The room was arranged formally, officials seated on either side, and at the head of the table sat Chief Raymond. He looked composed, but I could sense the undercurrent of apprehension beneath his mask of control. This was no longer a casual dismissal of my claims, it was the culmination of a battle that had stretched over months, testing patience, resilience, and moral courage. As I entered, he met my gaze, steady but cautious. There was no smirk, no dismissive glance, only the faintest trace of unease. For a moment, the room was quiet, the weight of anticipation almost tangible. I felt my heart pound, not with fear, but with the quiet intensity of purpose. "Officer Taylor," he began, voice calm, "you've presented a compelling case, but let's review it thoroughly, point by point." I nodded, aware that his attempt at control was part of the ritual. The power he had wielded through denial and dismissal was now being tested against a force he could no longer ignore. Meticulously documented truth and unwavering resolve, I began by walking the room through the sequence of events, showing the cross-referenced documents, witness statements, and recordings. I emphasized the correlations, the verified timelines, and the factual consistencies. Each detail was deliberate, each point methodical. The room's attention was sharp. Every officer present leaned forward, tracking the flow of evidence. Even Chief Raymond, whose confidence had once seemed unshakable, could no longer hide the cracks in his composure. "Chief," I said, voice steady, "this is not about opinion or personal perspective. It is about verifiable facts corroborated by multiple sources and documented thoroughly. Ignoring this evidence compromises not just the credibility of the department, but the trust of those it serves." He exhaled, fingers steepled, jaw tight. "You've been thorough, I admit, but interpretation, there are always nuances. Are you certain there's no room for misinterpretation?" I paused deliberately, letting the weight of the question settle. Nuance does not negate fact. Every detail aligns. Every witness corroborates the same sequence. The truth is not open to personal bias, it exists regardless of belief or authority. And today, accountability begins with acknowledgement of that truth. For the first time, I saw a flicker of tension break through his veneer. The chief's eyes shifted subtly, the micro-expressions of discomfort betraying his internal realization. The narrative he had tried to control was no longer his to manipulate. Every evasive tactic, every subtle denial, every attempt to undermine my credibility was collapsing under the weight of unassailable evidence. I moved to the next phase, presenting the impact of his initial dismissal, the ways in which bureaucratic inaction, delays, and personal disbelief had endangered accountability and compromised public trust. The room remained silent, the weight of the narrative pressing heavily upon every participant. Chief Raymond's defenses faltered further, his rigid composure cracking beneath the inevitability of exposure. "Officer Taylor," he finally spoke, voice tight, "you've forced me to confront something I wished I could have ignored. The evidence is irrefutable." Relief surged through me, but I maintained composure. This was not a moment for triumph or vindictiveness, it was a moment for clarity, for ensuring that accountability would follow. I continued to guide the room through final points, emphasizing corrective actions, procedural oversight, and the importance of systemic responsibility. The Pentagon liaison, Reynolds, leaned forward, voice firm, yet measured. "Chief Raymond, the facts are clear. Dismissing this evidence is no longer an option. Corrective measures must be implemented immediately to restore integrity and accountability." The chief's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of recognition pressing down. For months, he had relied on authority, influence, and dismissal to maintain control over the narrative. Now, confronted with unassailable truth, he had no recourse but to acknowledge the reality before him. The room held its collective breath as he processed the magnitude of the moment. Finally, he exhaled deeply and nodded. "You are right. The evidence is thorough, the witnesses are credible, and the inconsistencies cannot be ignored. I will cooperate fully with all investigations and corrective actions." In that instant, the confrontation reached its apex. The humiliation I had endured at his hands, the subtle denials, and the undermining of my credibility were transformed into validation, not personal satisfaction, but recognition of the power of truth, diligence, and resilience. Months of preparation, sleepless nights, and emotional strain had culminated in this moment of reckoning. I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. The chief's acknowledgement was not merely symbolic, it was procedural, systemic, and transformative. The web of denial he had spun over months was unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by accountability, transparency, and recognition of facts. The room, once a stage of subtle intimidation, had become a site of justice, carefully engineered through meticulous evidence, patience, and courage. After the meeting, I walked out with a sense of calm clarity. The confrontation had been intense, emotionally exhausting, and fraught with tension, but it was also definitive. The chief could no longer deny the truth, and the system was now positioned to respond appropriately. My persistence had transformed humiliation into empowerment, doubt into certainty, and exposure into accountability. That night, I reflected on the journey, the months of struggle, the webs of denial, the subtle psychological battles they had all led to this moment. The confrontation had proven that truth, rigorously documented and persistently presented, can pierce even the most fortified walls of ego, authority, and denial. The reckoning had intensified, and the moment of confrontation had changed everything. What once seemed impossible, forcing acknowledgement from someone determined to dismiss me, had been achieved through strategy, courage, and unwavering dedication to truth. I understood then that the fight was not just about vindication. It was about reinforcing integrity, restoring accountability, and reclaiming agency in a system that had initially tried to silence me. As I prepared for the final stage, the closure of this chapter and the reclamation of my life, I felt a profound sense of resolution. The confrontation had been demanding, but it had also been transformative. I had endured humiliation, navigated systemic denial, and faced formidable resistance, but in the end, truth had prevailed, and in that victory, quiet yet undeniable, I realized that the struggle had not only exposed the chief, it had exposed my own strength, resilience, and unwavering commitment to integrity. The confrontation had ended weeks ago, but its impact rippled through my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Chief Raymond's acknowledgement, once impossible to imagine, had set in motion a series of investigations, policy reviews, and procedural reforms within the department. For months, I watched the wheels of accountability turn, a slow but steady affirmation that the truth could not be buried forever. And through it all, I began to reclaim not just my professional standing, but the personal peace that had been fractured by months of humiliation and doubt. First, I didn't know what reclaiming my life truly meant. The sleepless nights, the constant tension, the mental strain of facing denial and disbelief, it all left an indelible mark. But slowly, as recognition of my work spread, a sense of validation replaced the lingering shame. Letters of commendation, formal acknowledgments from oversight committees, and quiet nods of respect from colleagues became evidence that my perseverance had mattered. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel proud without guilt, to accept recognition without deflecting it. One afternoon, I returned to the conference room where the final sessions with Chief Raymond had taken place. The room, once a place of tension and intimidation, now felt different, empty, silent, yet charged with the memory of months of struggle. I walked through the space, reflecting on every moment, the dismissals, the ridicule, the subtle attempts to undermine me. I realized that each trial, each challenge, had forged a version of myself stronger than I had ever known. The humiliation had been transformed into resolve, the denial into clarity, and the confrontation into empowerment. Outside the walls of the department, life also began to shift. Colleagues who had once avoided engagement now sought guidance, inquiries about procedures, and advice on navigating bureaucracy. I became a quiet reference point, someone who had endured systemic resistance, yet emerged not only intact, but stronger. The experience had given me perspective. Patience, persistence, and preparation were as important as courage in facing entrenched power. And as I shared my experience, carefully and thoughtfully, I realized that my journey had become more than personal vindication. It was a blueprint for integrity and accountability that others could follow. One evening, after reviewing a final batch of correspondence related to policy reforms, I sat alone at my desk. The silence was comforting, a stark contrast to the months of tension and constant vigilance. I allowed myself to reflect fully on the transformation I had undergone. The humiliation that had once consumed me now seemed like a distant shadow, a catalyst that had pushed me to act with clarity and purpose. I understood then that reclaiming my life was not just about external recognition, it was about internal affirmation, a reconciliation between who I had been and who I had become. I thought of the chief, who had once mocked, dismissed, and undermined me. The power he wielded had been formidable, but ultimately, it was fragile when confronted with documented truth and unwavering determination. He had been forced to acknowledge the evidence, to comply with accountability measures, and to recognize the systemic flaws that he had allowed to persist. And yet, I felt no triumph in his discomfort, only the quiet satisfaction that justice, integrity, and persistence had prevailed. The department itself began to change in response to the revelations. New procedures were instituted to ensure transparency, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and accountability became more than a word, it became a practice. I found myself involved in mentoring, advising on ethical practices, and helping implement safeguards against the very kind of dismissal and denial I had endured. The work was demanding, but it was deeply rewarding. I was no longer merely an observer of the system. I had become an agent of its transformation. One morning, as I walked through the office, colleagues greeted me with respect and recognition that had once felt impossible. There were no public celebrations, no grand announcements, just quiet, steady acknowledgement of the journey I had undertaken. And in those small gestures, I found the deepest form of closure, understanding that my perseverance had not only restored my credibility, but had strengthened the entire system around me. In personal reflection, I recognized the full arc of the experience. Humiliation had been the beginning, revealing the vulnerabilities of both the individual and the system. Backstory: the months of preparation, evidence gathering, and meticulous verification had provided the foundation. Revelation had come with the intervention of authority beyond the chief's reach, a turning point that set the stage for reckoning. And now, closure had arrived, not as an external declaration, but as a personal affirmation that integrity, persistence, and courage can reclaim what humiliation once sought to destroy. I allowed myself to smile quietly at the memory of the long nights, the tension, and the struggle. Each challenge, each moment of doubt, each confrontation had been a step toward reclaiming my life. I realized that the power of persistence and the strength of truth are not always immediate, they are cumulative, building slowly, but relentlessly, until they can no longer be ignored. Finally, I looked toward the future with clarity. My life, once overshadowed by humiliation and dismissal, was now defined by the reclamation of agency, purpose, and integrity. I had endured, I had persisted, and I had prevailed not through aggression, but through preparation, documentation, and unwavering moral courage. The lessons were profound. Accountability requires vigilance, truth demands persistence, and personal empowerment often emerges from the very trials that seem insurmountable. As I closed the last file, turned off the office lights, and stepped into the quiet evening, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The struggle had ended, but the transformation remained: a life reclaimed, a system nudged toward integrity, and a personal journey that had turned humiliation into empowerment. In the end, I was no longer defined by the dismissal, denial, or ridicule of others. I was defined by the truth I had fought to expose and the life I had courageously reclaimed.